network, along with the Center for Global Development, Interaction, and UN Foundation. And the idea between DevCom is to give communicators working in the international development field on the front line best practices and tools and resources to do the chapter. And coming out of that is a panel we have today. It's a panel on social media and development, how others do it. And we have very distinguished guests with us. Our moderator, Mark Goldberg, is a writer and blogger and consultant to several prominent national and international nonprofit organizations. He's the editor of the United Nations and Global Affairs blog UN Dispatch, which I'm sure is on everyone's morning reading lists, and editor of the Global Health and International Development website, PSI Healthy Lives. He is a correspondent with the American Prospect and hosts a regular program on bloggingheads.tv. From 2004 to 2006, Mark was a writing fellow at the American Prospect and a former research assistant at the New America Foundation. His work has been featured in numerous publications, such as the New York Times, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, the LA Times, and Newsweek. So I just want to point out that our network about us is up on the screen. In just a few minutes, I'll turn on the Twitter search function. If you find anything interesting about this panel, feel free to tweet it with the hashtag SN4D. Again, thank you so much for coming, and I'll turn it over to Mark now.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks to Hangout for hosting this panel. And I think we're all sort of part of the same family in this room here, and we're all sort of focused on the same issues. So I'd like to keep this somewhat informal. Feel free to pose questions to the panelists as we go. What I think is particularly interesting about this panel is that people, social media experts from different kinds of organizations with different goals in their social media strategies. Advocacy organizations, NGOs in the field, the think tank, and the World Bank. So I think to start off, I'm going to ask, we'll go down the table, ask everyone to introduce themselves, ask them to explain what their social media goals are, what are the tools they use to achieve that goal in about 5 minutes, and then we'll start getting into some of the meat. So we'll start with Oscar.
Hi everyone, my name is Molly.
Oh, sorry. Push your
my name is Molly Garib. I am the social media manager and blog editor for the One campaign. Basically, my job is split in two. There's the part where I have to curate blog posts and write blog posts surrounding our issues, help educate our members and our readers, and sort of keep them up to date with all the news that's happening. And the other part of it is to maintain our social media platforms, make sure that we're up to date on all the latest technologies, and also use those platforms as a way to promote our content and provide color and engagement to the petitions that we have and the policy pieces that we have. So our main form of communication is Facebook and Twitter. They both have two different audiences, which we can talk about later. And we also maintain a YouTube page, a Vimeo page. We even have a MySpace page, which I haven't given up on yet. I think that they're going to be a great musical revolution. I don't know how yet. And we're working on plans for Foursquare and for LinkedIn. So
great, and we'll get into we'll get into the meat of this a bit later.
Thanks. I'm Jim Rosenberg. For about the past year, I've been head of social media at the World Bank. I've been in the bank group for a total of around 6 years. Before this, I was at the microfinance group CGAP, where I worked on mobile money and set up one of the first blogs in the World Bank and one of the largest LinkedIn groups in the World Bank. In my current role, I basically wear two hats. One is to look at the kind of flagship global social media channels for the organization, as well as work on standards and guidelines for different units across the bank. Our social media goal is very straightforward, which is basically we're trying to open up the World Bank. If the World Bank is not open and transparent and having a real conversation, then it becomes irrelevant. And social media is one way for the bank to remain relevant. Tools, I could go into a lot of that, maybe I'll talk about that later. I think our biggest challenge, which is something I think is really useful to talk about with social media, because you know, I love the saying, there are no social media experts, there are only people who know things a few weeks before others do. And I think that's really the case with social media. But our real challenge right now is creating a feedback loop. So how do we systematically use social media for operational staff, non-communication staff, but people across the organization to listen. So social media for us is not just about talking; it's also about listening, and that's something that we're working on. You know, what's a systematic way to do that and build that into our work. And I have some interesting examples of that. Great, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Same here. Thanks for having me as well. I'm Linda Wallner, and I work at the Council on Foreign Relations in the Communications and Marketing Department. And from my vantage point, on a daily basis, I'm managing our Twitter feed and our Facebook page, but we also have a YouTube page that our multimedia team works to fill the content there. And then Foreign Affairs, our magazine, our bi-monthly magazine, has their own presence as well. But for the communications department, we also assist our experts in their social media engagement. So my role lets into a support facility as well. And we mainly use social media as kind of a brand engagement, a brand awareness vehicle, in addition to a distribution channel, like most people. We are, CFR, if you're not aware, is a resource on foreign policy issues, and so we don't really fundraise, we don't really raise awareness about issues, we are not nonprofit, we can't advocate, so it's really just kind of a news channel.
Sorry, this microphone's
That's okay.
So I'm Salma Barami with Mercy Corps. We're a global humanitarian organization. We work in over 40 countries now. That list keeps growing every day as another disaster or revolution happens. But social media has predominantly been a vehicle and continues to be a vehicle to tell our stories in the field. So stories from Libya to Myanmar to Somalia or Horn of Africa. It just provides us that lens of people on the ground who are benefiting from our programs, our staff who are there who are doing our work, and just a way to sort of engage our constituents, which are donors, stakeholders, media, individuals who are interested in international issues. And I've been with Mercy Corps, I think a little over 6 months, but I came from an agency background and a little bit of TV and
So it would actually seem that Sama and Jim have sort of similar challenges in engaging your own organizations to embrace these social media channels. Jim, you mentioned that sort of your goal is sort of almost inwardly focused to convince people at the World Bank to open up. I guess my question to you is, how do you sort of convince people who perhaps are not as fluent in social media to use it? How do you have that conversation with people who might be somewhat reluctant to embrace the medium?
So our goal is internal in the sense that we want to open it up. It's also external in the sense that we want people to know that we are interested in having a conversation. We are interested in engagement. So I think the biggest challenge with using social media in the development space is kind of striking the right balance between, there's some folks who are just terrified of it and they don't want anything to do with it. And then there are others who they've been on Facebook or Twitter in their personal lives, and so they think they can just start doing that for work. And it's a little different in terms of the way you would do that and be effective. So what we try to do is have peer learning, have operational colleagues who can talk to each other. There are some people who are just naturally good at it. Some of our stronger blogs. There's an education ICT specialist in the bank who, if I could clone him, I would. He is just naturally fluent in social media, and why he's good at it is he is using it to do his job. Part of his job is engaging with education experts around the world and having a conversation. And so he's using it to engage with research. So that, I think, is the kind of example that we'd like to see more.
And Solomon, you mentioned that one of your goals is to tell stories from the field. The field, as it were, can be kind of a difficult environment sometimes. Not only sort of just operationally, but the fact low bandwidth, hard to access, hard to people have time to tell these stories. How do you have that conversation with people that are working in these difficult environments? How do you convince them that this is an important thing to do when they presumably have other priorities of the day?
Yeah, so we have aid workers in 40 countries, like I mentioned, and some of them are a little bit more media savvy, and they understand that this sort of helps, provide light or shed light on an issue that may not. A lot of times we're on the ground where journalists are. Like, for example, I can tell you that in Libya we were on the ground before most journalists were, and so people relied on us to basically provide them news. And to a certain degree, the people are aid workers on the ground who understand that. But what I think is unique, and I don't know about organizations, but we're good at Mercy Corps is also deploying a communications person on the ground. So most of the time when you see our aid workers on the ground, you'll always have a communications person sort of facilitate media interviews or to provide that stream. And again, it depends on the field staff, and there are security and logistics issues involved with certain countries. We're having issues right now with Horn of Africa for obvious reasons. But again, it depends on the person, but we generally have a pretty media savvy staff, from the aid workers to the obviously the comms folks who are on the ground. But there's almost always somebody deployed somewhere we go on the comms team. For example, we're sending somebody out right now to the Somali border, and someone has just returned. So there's always that news stream that is coming out of the field. I'll be in Libya next week, so it's like there's always something in terms of the news cycle that we're able to connect with.
It would seem, I guess, you have sort of a large enough comms team to be able to do that, but not every organization presumably can afford that or has that kind of capacity. That's great. Linda, you mentioned that one of your uses of social media is as a distribution channel. I'm wondering for products like Foreign Affairs and for think tank reports coming from CFR, how does social media compare to traditional distribution channels? Is it more or less effective? Does it reach a different audience?
Yeah, we found social media to be a fantastic new tool in the communicator's toolbox. Previously, before we kind of jumped on the social media bandwagon, we had limited levers. We could write a press release for a new report. We could bother people like Mark about the new report. We could, get on the phone and talk to reporters. And now Facebook and Twitter particularly have been great. Much less time consuming and just easier all around from a human resources perspective to much easier channel to promote this research. A press release can take weeks depending on how much back and forth you go between the author of the report, make it go up the chain and everything. With a tweet, you can fail miserably if you tweet the wrong thing, but it can also be deleted and all that kind of stuff. But you can really, and you can continually tweet for the same tweet, the same basic tweet, and tweet it a couple of times over the course of a month, and it's just kind of a consistent push. Whereas a press release is kind of like this big bang and then just fizzles, So from a communications perspective, social media has been fantastic, different avenue for people, and you're right, it's definitely allowed us to reach different audiences. Our Facebook page, we have all kinds of people commenting on our research, whereas on our website there's no real mechanism for commenting. So it's great to see the general public engaged, for better or worse. So it's been great to kind of open up that line of communication to the general public as well.
Great, thanks. And finally, I wanted to ask Otto. So you mentioned you obviously use Twitter and Facebook to reach different audiences. Which audiences do you try to reach with Twitter, and which do you try to reach with Facebook, and sort of how do you differentiate?
Yeah. For Twitter, most of the people that are the audiences that are on there are sort of like partners, media people, kind of PR people, So, and we have like less real one members on there. Whereas on Facebook, we have a lot more one members, like just real people that we can post stuff like, check out this cool picture of this dog in one shirt. And like they will respond to that more than, somebody on Twitter, you post up a press release or something, that will like go more viral than on Facebook. So that's an interesting difference that we noticed. So we try to play that.
No, I actually wanted to maybe get into a deeper conversation about Facebook and Twitter. One thing I've noticed from looking at traffic coming into you on dispatch is that a Facebook like is worth more than a retweet. That we'll get more incoming traffic from someone liking one of our posts on Facebook than we will from having someone retweet it on Twitter. I'm not sure sort of why that is. Intuitively, it would seem that people are just want to click on that Facebook that item that comes up on their Facebook screen. Is that something? Have you noticed that as well? And how do you as a world bank decide how to deploy your Facebook page as opposed to your Twitter page?
So we, in terms of the kind of global channels at World Bank or Facebook.com/World Bank and their equivalents in Arabic, French, and Spanish, we're primarily using those as distribution channels. So we're linking to content that's coming off of blogs by experts. We're linking to news articles that we think could be interesting. We ask questions of the I hate the word audience because that implies a one-way channel, and that's definitely not what we're talking about. Community is kind of a precious word in this case, but it's kind of like that. So I think the way we measure success is engagement, and I think we definitely see that more on Facebook versus Twitter. I would definitely agree with what Molly was saying about Twitter being more of a kind of close in, what I would say fondly, the development nerd kind of crowd. Whereas Facebook, just the nature of Facebook, it's my mom's on Facebook. Today's my brother's birthday. Like it's my personal space, but there's also work things there. So if I see a development issue or content from a Facebook page and I have an emotional response to it, that's a lot more powerful in some ways than just retweeting something.
I wanted to ask, maybe sort of go down the table and ask, how many Twitter accounts do you manage? Do you have a personal one and a company one? And if so, how do you differentiate what's a tweet from which?
Well, I can tell you that Mercy Corps, we have one central Twitter account for voice, but then we syndicate a lot of different voices because, again, we rely on our field content a lot. So we have people in the field who have great Twitter followers. I have my own personal account that I almost always, sync up with work. So I manage the two accounts, the Mercy Corps and then my own. And a lot of times the content is pretty much the same. Though I'll sneak in things about my dog on my personal Twitter account, where I obviously wouldn't do that on work. But I can't even tell you how many Mercy Corps voices are sort of syndicated through that core account. We have thousands and thousands of people in the field. So if I see a great tweet from somebody in Indonesia, about our program, we almost always retweet it, just because a lot of what we do is try to reflect the culture of Mercy Corps, a lot of the voices, and the best way that we can do that is to sort of, throw them.
Can you maybe describe maybe in a bit more detail how that syndication actually works? Maybe as the first sort of dishing on tips and tools, or what do you use to make that happen?
I mean, generally, we have a sort of core network of people that we know are really active. We have people that we deploy on a regular basis, so I will be looking out for those a little bit more strongly. But if I see, a tweet with a Mercy Corps mention of, hey, I just visited this cool mobile money program in Indonesia, I'll send out a retweet, and then that'll just sort of gain a little bit more traction coming from the core Mercy Corps account. But again, it's also just re-emphasizing that we have many, many voices from the field up to the core headquarters.
So the way we have it structured is our on Twitter, our CFR_org account is mainly the channel for institutional news. It's not very colorful. We rely on our fellows to provide the color, their personal insights, all that kind of thing. But the CFR institutional account is just, it's better than an RSS feed for sure. But it is meant to be, you know, an institution, not a person. And there's some drawbacks to that. You know, CFR, the institutional account, where, you know, a person, they've had insights, they've had ideas, but because of our mission and our mandate, our organization takes no institutional positions on any policy matters. So we're very confined in terms of what we can tweet. And we have to be very careful when we're tweeting the opinions of others to make sure that's very clearly labeled, you know, our expert, Global Governance Institute expert says this. And it can really easily get misconstrued on Twitter because when you're trying to shorten and retweet, you just get rid of that person's name and you just say CFR says this. And then I kind of say, oh no, you know, we don't say anything, you know, we're a channel, you know, other people think of things and we distribute it, you know. Well, so that can be a challenge.
Let me ask you, how do you deal with those situations as they arise on Twitter? Someone, you know, says something, CFR says this. Do you, how do you respond to that on Twitter?
I've given up. It happens so often, to be honest.
That's one strategy.
Yeah. I mean, it's a misperception that happens in any channel, not just Twitter. And you know, if we try to push back on everyone, that kind of gets it wrong. I mean, most people are just trying to do us a favor. You know, oh, I really enjoyed this report, even though it's not by CFR, it's by this person. I'm going to retweet it, and they mention us. You know, I'm not going to be like, oh, you know, thanks for mentioning me, but you got it all wrong. You know, so I'm not going to call them out. You know, but yeah, it's really just too difficult to kind of spend all your time pushing back on that kind of thing.
You know, what I think just before the panel started, we were talking about the traditional communications person's mindset, and I think there's always this urge to control messages, control timing, control pacing, and the thing about social media is it's creating this digital, especially with mobile devices, it's creating this digital layer over our lives. It's creating a digital layer over what we do. So if your experts are on Twitter, or our experts are on Twitter, you know, that personal and the professional can get commingled. And I think it's really important to have very clear guidelines and standards so people know how to act and what to do, you know, what's best practice. Because you know, what you're talking about where things get conflated, like we have that sometimes too, and that chasing after every little thing it's a losing battle.
Yeah, very much.
I guess, how do you decide what to chase after?
Some of that's a judgment call. I mean, there have been very few instances where we have staff do things in social media that were of concern to us. What we're more interested in is if someone has something that's inaccurate, or if someone says something that maybe is one-sided, then we may respond to them. There have also been NGO campaigns about certain things that have been certain bank strategies that have been underway, and those are interesting because that, you know, our strategies are decided by our board, by our shareholders, which are the governance of the world. So it's not my place as a communications person to weigh into that debate. That's for our shareholders to discuss. So in those instances, we will engage with critical voices and we will let them know that we're listening, which is true. We do listen and feedback what's going on in social to very senior management. But we're limited by what we can do.
As I'm sure most people, you know, in the room are no doubt aware, you know, there's a very active development-focused Twitterverse and blogosphere. And you know, if you know this group has maybe one characteristic, it's that they can be sort of very critical. And I'm not being critical when I say that. You know, I think it's a very healthy thing to be critical, but oftentimes the venom can be directed at you know, organizations, you know, NGOs represented at this panel. And I'm wondering, you know, how do you sort of deal with when sort of an emerging meme is unfolding that potentially paints your organization in a negative light? I'm wondering, have you at One ever experienced this? I know you use a lot of celebrity advocates,
yeah.
And that's something that is somewhat controversial among sort of the blogosphere, the Twitter blogosphere.
Yeah, we get into crisis mode,
Okay.
which is basically, monitoring Twitter and Facebook like a hawk and pulling out all those critical comments. And then at this point, we'll consult with our communications team. We're going to do a huddle on what we should do communications-wise, what our top-line messages should be on the issue, and then hopefully if that doesn't have a long turnaround, we'll come back and try to pinpoint one other. I think Bono was criticized for spending only 1% of one's money toward poverty projects, but the thing is that we're an advocacy organization, so that's not really what we do. So when that happened, we basically came up with a press release, and we said, okay, if anybody has anything to say critically about this issue, then we'll just direct them to the press release. But after that, there's not really much more we can do. So, and then we get to cut our losses or.
That's actually maybe kicking off to a question about sort of crisis mode. What is, I guess, presumably CFR, there's less of a crisis mode mentality, so you're maybe attacked less potentially than advocacy organizations, but I guess how do you deal with the emerging social, or has there been an example of an emerging sort of social media campaign bubbling against CFR, and how do you push back against that?
Yeah, we've been hesitant to push back against negative comments on social media are just kind of par for the course. And so we've been hesitant to kind of directly challenge those. There's just so much being said on Twitter overall, and Twitter is so fleeting, and same with Facebook, that we don't think it's a good use of our time to really engage with people who are already kind of having a negative mindset about their organization. So that's been kind of our the way we've approached it now, and we're just kind of seeing how things develop. We take our Twitter following and Facebook presence, the fact that it's growing, to be evidence that on the whole, our engagement is overall a good use of our time, and it's creating a net benefit rather than a net negative. But there is, of course, kind of like a little negative undercurrent, and that's to be expected when you expose yourself on social media. That's what you're really doing.
Any thoughts and examples that?
I think the one thing that happens probably most frequently is like on Facebook. On Twitter it doesn't happen as much, but we'll get comments on Facebook that if we put out an appeal for Somalia right now, we'll get comments from people saying there are hungry people right here in the U.S. We get that a lot, and of course, and it's obviously not to marginalize that issue. It's just a separate organization. We happen to be an international relief organization. So my personal side wants to comment and say, well, why are you here, on our Facebook page? But the professional side, and in the beginning, I think I probably did this where, you get into kind of like a debate, and I realized really quickly, if you engage with people, like every naysayer on Facebook, it'll just become having an argument for the sake of the argument, or the debate, I should say, as opposed to just sticking to the core issue. So now I try once in a while to put, a message that says, we totally support that, but as an international relief organization, we are focused on this, but, just try to mitigate a little bit, but not respond to everything, because it'll be endless if you respond to everything.
So I wanted to ask about sort of new and emerging social media platforms. I think probably like most people in this room, I'm at the same time fascinated and bewildered by Google Plus. I'm sort of, I'm testing the waters a bit, and I found, for example, one potentially interesting thing to use on Google Plus is the Hangout function. I don't know how many people have done that yet, but essentially it allows a video conferencing platform. And I tested it out with a few of our UN dispatch writers the other day, and it can be such a potentially interesting way of deepening our engagement with our audience by having sort of like a weekly hangout, inviting readers to come interact with us, or perhaps even inviting specialists from the World Bank to come on, and we can have our readers asking questions, our writers asking questions. There seems to be a lot of potential without, you know, one specific function of Google Buzz, but I'm still trying to stay on the tires and figure it out. But I wanted to ask, I mean, how do you, I guess Google Buzz, you know, specifically, because that's the new and emerging cool thing out there. How has one approached it, and do you guys have like a Google Plus strategy yet?
Yeah, you know, we have a lot of people on our new media team, and we've all come up with great ideas of what we should add to our, you know, social media strategy. And one of our developers suggested a long time ago that we add a Google Plus button, and we were very dubious, and we were like, I don't think so. This is weird. We don't even have an invite yet. But we are really glad that we did, because now we have one. It's just that now the question is what to do with it, or will it be helpful for us? So people are, you know, I'm sure you've all experimented with Google Plus now. You're on it, great. You've added people to your circles, but now what, you know? And that's how we kind of feel at One. We were doing a lot of research and, you know, talking to people about how they're applying it to nonprofit strategy, like, you know, the nonprofit world. And we have something called Google Plus for businesses. So we signed up for that. We'll see what happens to that. But yeah, we have it on our blog post now, so you can plus it if you'd like, which goes to your page. But you might have more ideas where the future is going.
I was on vacation in earlier this month, and I stay at the business. I recommend this for everybody who go on vacation. Stay off Facebook, stay off Twitter. I locked my BlackBerry in my desk. I actually, parts of my brain woke up that had gone dormant. But I came back and Facebook people post, you know, they launched a new social network while you were gone. Ha ha ha. Now tell us what to do with it. And I think, I mean, one thing I would say is, for us, it's really important to know what's on the bleeding edge of technology and what's possible. Especially if your audience, like our Facebook audience, 80% of our audience is outside the US. So it's really important for us to get up to the minute on what people in Chennai or Jakarta are doing in social media. So that said, you know, if you put resources and time and staff and money into every new thing that happens as an organization, especially if you know you don't have the budget resources, you know, like for us, we don't have dedicated budget for social media. We have to kind of go and make the case all the time, and that's fine. But we will wait to see if something like Google Plus really catches on to the point where it makes sense for us to get involved. You know, what's the use case for it? I mean, we have a big challenge with our information security requirements around just having Facebook and Twitter plugins on our web pages. So I think it's two things. One is to be experimental and try really crazy stuff, and that's fun. Where you can do a bit of a pilot and see, you know, kind of test the water. But it's also being really kind of judicious and selective about what you really spend a lot of time on. I mean, for us, Google Plus, my friends who are on Google Plus are all the technology nerds and, you know, people who would be on there anyway, and we're all kind of sitting there going, wow, what are we doing here? But I like the idea of the Hangout. I think
it could be interesting. It has potential. The one sort of drawback I see so far, there's no sort of moderator function, so anyone can sort of chime. Yeah, well, anyone can sort of chime in at any time. So you know, I think that they're still developing this stuff. So maybe in the future they'll add, you know, a new button. So is CFR on Google Plus?
No, I have everything. I second everything that Jen said. Okay. I'm really jealous, Monica, of your new media team. I'm pretty much like the new media team, and Twitter and Facebook just kind of fell in my lap. So we definitely are a bit under-resourced to take on new and burgeoning social media channels. Although Google Plus will definitely be, you know, one that will, I predict, not that I have any standard knowledge or anything, but I like it, you know, so far that I've used it. It's kind of a way to start anew, you know, using Facebook now for a little bit. So as a personal user, I enjoy Google+, and I would imagine that once Google+ for businesses gets up and running, it's going to be a really great added channel. I'd also like to keep an eye out for when they start running ads. I don't know if they have even started doing that yet, but I mean, our Facebook ads, we don't use very much, but they've been very effective, much more effective than like our community resources posting links on Facebook. And you can just, I mean, as long as you set up a campaign properly, you can just kind of set it and forget it a little bit. So it would be great to be able to do that in Google+ as well, especially since it's so integrated with search.
We're not on Google+ officially, but we have people with that sort of the web guys or the web geeks that are testing the waters. I think if it reaches a critical mass, of course we'll join, but I think the question right now is how does the content and the audience differentiate from, how is it different from Facebook? And right now we're not sure yet, so I think once we establish that, we'll probably dive in.
I did just think of, I just remembered something that I read yesterday, which is Google+, if you fill out your profile, you can actually put code into your web pages, your profile pages, your author bio on your website, so that if you searched for, you know, so-and-so water expert, put in that person's name, if we had that code in our website, their picture would show up in the search results. Mm-hmm. So the idea is to make Google search results more social. I'll try to tweak that link later today.
Yeah, that'd be nice. So, audience, any thoughts, questions? Yeah, sure. Oh, wait, we have a microphone, so and you know, just introduce yourself.
Hello, are they working? Yeah, okay, great.
I'm Elizabeth Wilhelm. I'm the specialist at Brenton. So I am not of the NGO world, but I certainly listen to many conversations with people in the Stern Hack online. And I think this conversation that you guys have been having is really interesting. But I think only the World Bank has really kind of touched on the question that I have for you guys. A lot of this assumes that a lot of social media outreach is happening in the developed world. What about things that are directed towards the developing world? And the reason I say that is we recently did a public health campaign in Kenya. The last 5 weeks, and I was lucky enough to be on ground. And I was doing little live tweeting of what was happening, tweeting pictures, posting links to videos, doing all the traditional PR stuff. What I wasn't expecting was people tweeting us being like, hey, you haven't reached our village yet, when are we getting our water filters? You know, or people posting on our Facebook wall being like, you know, my motorbike driver says it hasn't been paid yet. So it's like, okay, now you're dealing with HR resources in a very public setting. You know, and so that's my question to you guys. Have you really thought about not just using social media? Well, first of all, my first question is, how do you use social media towards the developing world as opposed to tweeting about what's happening in the developing world? And my second part of that question is, are other people in your organizations working on social media outside of the communications office, like in a programmatic way? When someone says, you know, no one has reached my village yet, when are you guys coming? You know, obviously that's not a question I can answer, but I have to take them to the campaign manager, for example. So how do you guys deal with that?
Okay. Actually, this seems like something you might.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can tell you, for example, like, we launched Twitter and the blog, I think in late 2008. So they're both sort of complementary of our approach. And Twitter has become sort of an extension of the blog, not an extension, but of our storytelling. When in January of 2010, when the Haiti earthquake happened, we went from like 3,000 followers to 8,000 followers. So we saw a clear surge of support during emergency times. That said, when we went into Haiti, we had no idea that people were actually pretty, and it's obviously not a developed country, but pretty media tuned in. So we did have people, and some of it was a mix of people who were benefiting from our programs who were wired, and people, and journalists on the ground, because obviously you saw that influx of journalists going into Haiti, and so it served a dual kind of purpose. But we, of course, like, it's never going to be, I think, the external stuff is never going to rival the internal stuff when you talk about the truly underdeveloped nation. I work on a lot of our Middle East programs, and a lot of people would assume that those audiences are not tuned in, and I think we have seen lately that they clearly are. Some developed nations, some not. So I think it just depends on the context, really. But I mean, we try to talk about the news, and we try to lend a voice to the people who are on the ground, whether they're in developed countries or not. We don't really work in many developed countries, but a lot of the times it just depends on the infrastructure, the context of the country.
No. Why don't we answer? Why don't we answer?
I just want to say that at one we have a team in Africa that deals with social media and outreach there, and they've told us that a lot of people don't have Twitter, and a lot of people don't have Facebook either. So, but they sort of switched their outreach goals into newspaper. They say that as long as an African person sees it in an actual paper news, and they'll believe it. So they have this whole plan, targeted sort of offline outreach, just so they can hit those people not using the internet.
I think if the next billion people who are going to get online are going to do it through a mobile device, and they're not going to be using a website, they're going to use Facebook or some other kind of social media. Probably, I think Facebook. I mean, if you look at Facebook's development strategy and their growth strategy over the next 18 months, it's totally mobile, and it's almost entirely focused on emerging markets. So I think any organization that is in the development conversation needs to be mindful that we're not sitting in Washington telling everyone else how to run their country or how to develop. It's a multi-part conversation. It's an open conversation. And I think, we definitely see that in social media. Most of our social media activity is not in development countries.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Rudy Grave. I'm with USA Film Pyramid. I wanted to ask, maybe Salman and you guys can answer, how has your strategy towards the Middle East changed over the last several months, and what new approaches have you taken, or what new audiences are you trying to get?
Well, I can tell you, for example, the Middle East is, it's tricky, it's contentious. Our programs are there, a lot of them are they were emergency based in the onset. I'll talk about Libya specifically. Right now, I think 4 months after the violence broke out, we're now in sort of long-term programming. So our social media is a reflection of that. When we went in, it was, how do we get, there was an influx again of journalists on the ground. So a lot of it in the beginning was how to connect to CNN, who's on the ground right there, and it became a little bit more about that. And our emergency team was going in, it was like that real-time news updates, and it became a logistical thing because the telecommunications was basically put out by the Gaddafi regime. So and somehow, Twitter became kind of a vehicle for us working on our satellite phones to be able to connect with journalists. Now that we're looking at longer-term programming, we're looking at sort of telling those stories about the Libyan people and what they're, what they need. And so it's just really a reflection of our actual work and what we're doing. But that said, we're not an advocacy organization, and so we try not to politicize these issues. We're first and foremost a humanitarian organization, and so we're talking about people and issues, not the politicized. We don't care about the regime. It's ultimately about benefiting people who need our help.
At the World Bank, what's happened with that part of the world is, I think with a lot of other organizations, there's a real rush to open up and have those tools and have those channels where you can have a dialogue. So we launched, my colleagues who work on our multilingual team, and my colleagues who work in the Middle East and Africa division of the bank, launched Twitter in Arabic, Facebook in Arabic. Egypt's the largest country for the Facebook in Arabic page. We launched a blog that's in French, Arabic, and English to try and get that feedback loop going even more strongly. And in March, we actually did our first live event, which was webcast on Facebook. That was the first for the bank, called Arab Voices and Views. And if you search for that, there's actually a video on YouTube that kind of summarizes the event. That's a very World Bank way of saying it. It's kind of, I think it's a cool little video, but
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Junior Bridge, and I'm a federal contractor. We're working with our agency clients to put together a social media strategy. They want to go about it differently, but we think that they need to start thinking about cool things like staffing, gatekeeping, cost effectiveness. So if you could offer any comments, advice on that front, love to hear them. Thank you.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, we found it, the way that we've configured our institutional channel is we have so much content being produced, mainly for our website, in addition to research and that kind of stuff on a daily basis, that just for human resources sake, it's easier to kind of share our institutional channel between two departments. But we found that giving too many people with like a loose ability to kind of jump on the channel and tweet something or post something can lead to confusion, and then you end up posting on top of each other, and you have like 3 posts right around and nothing for 3 hours, you know. So it's just easier to kind of appoint 2 people within the same 2 different departments as kind of the leads and let them kind of work it out and space things out and that kind of thing. Make sure you're not being redundant, that kind of thing. So it's good to kind of think, you know, about the actual, think about the operational plan for how to actually post things. And then what other considerations do you want? Staffing. Yeah, I mean, if you need to prove ROI to, you know, the powers that be, it takes time. You know, you need to build, if you're going to start at 0 followers, and, you know, a month later you have 30 followers, that's a 30% increase, but are the powers that be going to be happy with that, you know? So it's good to set some initial goals, and, you know, if you haven't dabbled with it yet, it's really hard to even set those goals. It's kind of a chicken or the egg. But it helps if people are just kind of willing to experiment. You really have to go with an experimental mentality, because you just don't know what's going to happen when you try it, you know? And so the way that we kind of approached it is, okay, do what we do on other platforms, but on social media. So when an expert goes on MSNBC or something to talk about that, he's going to talk in the same way on Twitter, you know. So therefore, you can kind of people it in your head as something that we already do, so it doesn't feel as scary, and you know, you can kind of slowly wade into the waters that way.
And can I also add? I mean, I think the upfront cost is a staff person. I think it's pretty wise to dedicate a specific person to social media, because I think what works about it is that it's constant. And if you have the same person doing Twitter and Facebook that has another job that may be in the communications department, I don't know if it would work. So the upfront cost is usually typically the labor, because obviously the tools are free. And for us, again, it's an extension of what we already have. So we have strong web content, strong photos, strong video collateral, and it just becomes another vehicle for putting that out. But you need that person to do that. And again, and some of the times, and I'm guessing if it's a federal contractor, the metrics are going to probably throw them for a loop. They probably don't know what a follower is, or, you know, they're looking for a quantitative, like a dollar value. And a lot of times you don't get that. For us, for example, we don't do strong donor appeals on Facebook or Twitter. A lot of it comes from email campaigns that are targeted to, you know, previous donors or businesses or whatever. So we're usually trying to reach people who are just engaged in our issues. So you have to kind of recognize that it may not necessarily bring back the dollar amount for you guys, but in terms of visibility and engagement, I think those things are, the metrics are a little different. You just have to educate them on that.
Yeah, I think, sorry. In terms of staffing, you know, I worked in radio for almost 10 years, and we used to joke that if there was a program that had dogs barking every day at 6 a.m. for 10 minutes, and then, you know, people would get used to listening to it, and then if you took it off the air, people would get mad. No matter what, if you made a change, they would get mad. But I think what that means is that consistency is really important, and that constant kind of touch point of, you know, we're going to tweet 6 times a day, we're going to be on Facebook 4 times, whatever it is. And the main thing is to staff and to go out with the kind of just enough output that meets the resources you have. So don't, you know, I have some colleagues last year who were working on a particular issue, and they launched 15 different social media accounts. And this was before we had any rules in place about what the minimum requirements were for a social media account in the organization. And the person wasn't full-time. So we now have these 15 orphaned sad, lonely accounts that are just kind of out there. So I'd say go slow, and maybe build. If you can build a case for positive feedback over time or whatever the objectives are, and you can build on that.
I have a quick question for the audience. So how many people in the room are in charge of their organization's Twitter account? And you say that you tweet, right? Maybe keep your hands up. Do you tweet, say, more than 5 times a day? Keep your hands up. More than 10 times a day?
Do retweets count?
Yeah, retweets count. Yeah. More than 20? Okay, I was just curious. I guess one of the it's hard to, I think, know what is the right number of tweets throughout the day. But if you're ever to err, I would definitely err on the side of more rather than less. And retweets, I think, certainly count. I mean, you have to keep in mind you're still adding value to your followers when you're retweeting something. You're finding something that you find interesting, sharing that with your followers, and that's really useful. And I think I just can't stress enough how I think important it is to tweet frequently, often, engage with people on Twitter, and retweet liberally. With that, if you have a question, yeah. I think it's being recorded. So, yeah.
Caroline from Oscar International. So we obviously use social media in humanitarian contexts, directed at a lot of journalists, and similarly to when a lot of the social media outreach we do is around campaigns, also has a direct kind of media component, news media component. I'm interested to hear from the bank how much of what you're doing is targeted at sort of traditional media kind of journalists, and what kind of uptake are you seeing from news media around the social media work that you're doing, and also what is your relationship with the bank's media team? I mean, obviously they're tweeting summaries of the press releases that they put out every day, but are they doing more? Is there a deeper kind of relationship, or are they not really seeing at this point that there's a value in pushing out social media and journalists particularly?
So we're on the same team. So we're in the same meeting. So if there's a major report, for example, the Horn of Africa announcement, the World Bank announced Monday that it would pull together $500 million in funding for the famine situation. That was something over the weekend we were constantly in touch with each other as our management and operational colleagues pulled together the details of what was going to happen. My colleagues were working on the press release, keeping me apprised of, this is what we need to do. If I saw anything in social media that would be relevant to them, I would feed that back to them. So it's kind of a conversation. And when you asked for specifically targeting journalists, we're not specifically targeting them. That's the media team's job. But I think it's really important when you're communicating to say the same thing lots of times and lots of different ways. And so we have a press release going out. We will definitely have social media component to it. If we see things happening in social media that are relevant to the news team to know, we'll also feed that back to them. And that's something our senior management pays attention to. So it's increasingly exciting and kind of chaotic, I think, for all of us, because the old rules just don't apply anymore. But I think that's a good thing. It just means more work on weekends and evenings.
Mike's coming. Well, it's for the video.
So, Naomi Johnson. I was curious, you mentioned more tweets rather than less, and I just hope you could elaborate on that. Is it about granularity? Is it about conversation? Do you worry that if you tweet too much as an organization, you lose followers overwhelmingly?
I think if you sort of spam tweet, if you sort of retweet 5 different things within a minute, and so it shows up on someone's screen as like CFR, that not like you would never do that. But you know, I think that's problematic. But if you can space them out, and there are tools that will let you space out your retweets and your tweet, you can time your tweets. At some point in the future, we'll have you longer sleep. I think is helpful because you'll only grow followers. I don't think you will lose followers. Because again, people follow you for a reason, and that reason, for the most part, is because you provide some sort of value to them. I think you're still providing that value. You know, by flagging something you find interesting, you know, you're helping. You're helping your followers. I don't know if other people have sort of a golden number of tweets per day rule, but
we try to tweet between 10 and 15 times a day. That's a huge schedule. So for Facebook, no more than 3. Because people get really annoyed with updates. That's how we feel on Facebook.
I guess another thing from my personal experience, so I manage 2 accounts. My own sort of personal one is public, Mark L. Goldberg, and also UN Dispatch. The UN Dispatch one has probably twice as many followers as my personal one. But you know, I try to be strategic about what I tweet to each. I think my personal one is followed by fewer people, but those people tend to be bloggers and journalists who are my friends, who in turn have tens of thousands of followers. So it's sort of like a risk reward. I'll maybe go for the home run if I'm tweeting something that maybe someone with 90,000 followers will retweet. Whereas if I'm putting it out at UN Dispatch, chances are more people will retweet it, but the people who retweet it will have fewer followers.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, and over time you'll kind of figure out what's the best use of your tweeting, your tweets for the day. One thing that we've noticed is that when looking at the analytics from the links that we contain in our tweets, the highest number of clicks come from tweets that were tweeted at 5 p.m., like 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. And I'm guessing it's because folks are on the commute then. This, of course, if your following base is all over the world, it's really hard to guess when they're commuting, especially the time zone. So, but I guess that we do have a significant amount of people that are either on East Coast time or at least U.S. time. And so we've noticed. So I'll try and strategize. One big, a good tweet that I really am hoping to get out there. I'll program that to go between 5:30 and 6, just hoping that doesn't always close to my people.
I've heard that too as well, that there's the most active.
Yeah. Same with Facebook. I mean,
yeah.
when you're at work, hopefully you're not on Facebook all the time, but if you're on myself. So we try to, we know that folks you have a greater likelihood of people liking and sharing your stuff if you're posting in the off hours. So we use Hootsuite to
questions? Yeah.
Choreograph report from USA. I'm wondering if beyond the quantitative metrics, do any of you do qualitative monitoring and analysis, sentiment, are there any topics that within the development community and social media are trending, so to speak?
Definitely.
Yeah. We had research that came out in February that found 44 million people have been pushing into poverty because of rising food prices. And when that report came out, and within 24 hours, it had been seen by 6 or 7 million people on Twitter. I mean, it was just incredible, the response to that. And I think that number is really compelling and shocking and horrible, but it's also the issue. So that's a big one. But also, I think disasters are big. It depends on the I guess.
Yeah, like I said before, we get a huge surge when there are disasters, but then there are some disasters that aren't necessarily heavily ingrained in traditional media, so sometimes you don't see it reflected in social media. Horn of Africa was one until just recently. But no, I think for us, our approach is pretty thoughtful in terms of engaging with people, regardless of the sort of quantitative metrics behind it. The one thing is we definitely right now we're kind of trying to encroach in this whole celebrity thing. And I mean, obviously we notice when a celebrity retweets something, we're doing doing or whatever, or something about in relation to Mercy Corps, it gets a huge amount of following. But then we have certain people that may be connected to just the right people who are really entrenched in our issues. So it really is about being strategic and thoughtful in your approach, and sometimes kind of taking the metrics out of it almost, because you have, I mean, it's kind of the same thing as your donor base. You want to, you know, engage with the people who are donating $5 a month as you would with the people who are, you know, your big corporate donors, because they all, in some sense, contribute to the, you know, your organization. So our social media is really a reflection of that, to be honest.
Actually, it's funny that you asked that, because we at One just started taking a look at our LinkedIn group again, and you know, we've been playing around with it, experimenting for the past 2 or 3 weeks, but we found that we're still working on strategy, but we found that it's kind of hard to engage with these folks online because we have nothing to offer them other than like blog posts and petitions to sign, you know, and that's not where you go to do those things, you know. So we're sort of shifting things as you know, maybe they add this one group to their LinkedIn page, like show that they are a member, and like add it to their resume and show that advocacy is part of this thing that they do in their everyday life and is something worthy to put on their like CV. So we're trying that, but who knows where that will go. But
it seems like our groups have been, we're putting out a publication or a case study or something on a technical issue around HIV prevention. It seems like the experts, you know, in what they're interested in HIV prevention, and that's something to say, start to really get the conversation going. And that's the next way. Obviously, great awareness about our issues.
Question in the back, yeah.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anita, and I work as a consultant at Global Health NGOs. And I was interested sort of building on the idea of analytics and tracking progress. I guess specifically for the One campaign, you do a lot of fundraising from the sort of mainstream citizen. And so are you using social media to that end? And do you have any examples of success stories or how that's impacted your fundraising strategy over at One? And then also back to Salma, you had mentioned Mercy Corps doesn't use your social media channels very much for...
Not successfully.
Okay, and maybe why you think that is, or is there a different culture in the followers on Twitter and Facebook where it's not as appropriate, or why that might be?
Actually, One is not a fundraising organization. They do advocacy, so we don't ask for money. But what we do ask for is your voice, which is petition signatures, and it's for you to become a member. And we found that social media is actually not the best way to do that. It's actually emails to people and having them share amongst themselves. Local events, that's what really brings in One members. So as far as social media goes, yeah, it's been a real challenge. That's something that we sort of struggle with. You know, when we put out a petition, that doesn't get as many from our main One account. That doesn't get as many shares or retweets as, you know, I don't know, like a policy analysis post or something like that. So it's really, it has to be done at a grassroots level at events and that kind of thing. And we try to use our social media to supplement the petitions that we have. So we'll build stories or blog series or, you know, photo series around that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry about the
fundraising.
Okay. I know that One was affiliated with the Red campaign for a bit, and so I sort of thought maybe there was a way that you were using social media to get the word out about that. And then,
yeah, so for us, using social media, Twitter and Facebook has just not been terribly successful in terms of fundraising, and I think it's probably just the wrong venue or the wrong outlet for it. For example, the Horn of Africa, in 2 weeks we raised $500,000 from private donors, so individuals, right? I think 1,000 of that came from Facebook and Twitter. So, and the large chunk of that came from direct email. And I think it's probably because those people, it takes a little bit, I don't want to say it takes more effort, but it's people who really want to receive your news regularly, whereas Twitter and Facebook, I mean, the content is kind of the same. Obviously for Facebook, it's a lot more visual. We do a lot of photo essays. Twitter, same thing, it's more newsy, but it really is just sort of like a news stream for us as opposed to reeling in that, or converting it to a donation. We'd love to see that increase, but I don't think that's really where a large chunk of our funding is going to come from. It still, like, historically has come from direct emails.
And also, I'd be interested, other than the organizations represented on the panel, you all had other organizations that you thought of as models in the social media sphere and you thought were doing particularly great jobs using social media?
Well, we love the one campaign.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Does the one campaign love the roll back?
I also love when I get an email from Christy Hurlington because I always think it's like her writing me personally. And then I realize I'm on like an email list, but yeah.
I mean, I guess here's any other think tanks that work in the sphere, New American Foundation.
Yeah, I haven't followed them very closely. I know that Heritage has an enormous amount of followers and fans, and that's always, it's always nice to have some healthy competition. But I don't think we really follow. If we didn't, there really is no competition. But it is nice to see how other think tanks, given that they're constrained by the same factors that we are, it is fun to see how other think tanks work.
I like Oxfam too. I think they do a really good job of storytelling and humanizing issues in a very thoughtful, obscure part of the world for our U.S. audience.
The wildlife fund.
I would give a shout out to the British government, actually. They, back really when this was kind of still new and dangerous technology, they embraced it, and in a way where you would have the foreign minister Miliband would actually engage in debate, not just sort of regurgitate talking points or press releases, but he had a personal blog that he would update and actually interact with readers and challenge people and say things that were maybe edgy, and it was fascinating to watch. And that I think trickled down to a lot of their embassies. Their former ambassador here, Scheinwald, was very good at it. And to their credit, the new British government has sort of kept the flame alive as well. So they're good. Any other question? Any questions? Yeah.
I had one more question.
Sure.
Linda, you mentioned earlier, you talked a little bit about brand awareness as well as distribution. Do you have any separate sort of strategy or approach with trying to raise awareness about your brand?
Can we just gather a couple of questions in the seconds left? So, you had a question back this morning.
I'm Emily Flora from Development Gateway. We're thinking about starting a Flickr feed or channel. I'm just wondering if any of you use Flickr, and is there much of a reason to do that as opposed to just posting photos on Facebook or Twitter? And if you do use it, how do you get a steady supply of good, quality photos? Because most of ours come from our staff who are in the field, and they're not professional photographers, and they're just snapping pictures with their camera. So I think that's a challenge. Any thoughts would be appreciated.
Any other questions? Final questions? Okay, so.
Sure. So tips on using social media for raising brand awareness. It's a complete mystery to me. Our Foreign Affairs magazine's Twitter feed and their Facebook page, their followers just exponentially increase, and they only tweet like once, maybe twice a day, post on Facebook once a day maximum. And here I am like frantically, tweeting, and they just feel like they're forever like 20,000 at least fans or followers ahead of us. And I just don't understand, I think what it is, most of them are probably subscribers that follow Foreign Affairs, and they maybe they're on Twitter and they want to kind of associate themselves with this brand that they enjoy so much in person. And so I think that that's just kind of meant, right? Communicators work all day to try to make that happen, and it's one of those kind of technical things that just kind of comes together. I don't know if anyone else has kind of cracked this code, but it's just, the CFR's approach has been like tweet frequently, get a lot of content out there, make sure that we're accessible and that kind of thing. And we're definitely seeing our following increase, but not at the same rate that Foreign Affairs has.
I think making the shift from it's a marketing channel to it's an engagement way of engaging, and it just shocks people when the World Bank writes back to them on Facebook. They read what I said. There was major flooding in Pakistan, I think last year, and there was a major aid package that was put together for that, and there was a video that was made. We posted the video on our Facebook wall, And immediately people started saying, why did you make a video? Why don't you help the people of Pakistan instead of making pretty videos? I thought, I didn't expect that. So it was like 11 o'clock at night. I'm sitting there on my sofa looking at a person on our Facebook page. But I linked, I wrote to them and I said, this is what we're doing. Here's a link to the website. You need an up-to-date website with good content. And then immediately, the comments, there was more than one person making these comments, because they all just started feeding, like, yeah, why are you making videos? And then it turned into this, wow, that's really great, like, you're doing something. So the engagement is not just a trick or some kind of trendy thing. I mean, it's harder for people to hate you or be saying inaccurate things about you if they know who you are. And you listen. You actually listen.
Flickr?
We just went through this battle with Flickr. We were going to switch over to 500px, which we're glad we're not doing that anymore. But anyway, I love Flickr. I use it as a place to store all our photos, and not just using the slideshow feature to embed that on blog posts and all that kind of thing. But as far as like where do you get the photos from? From your partners, from Oxfam, or from like Save the Children. Ask them if you can borrow their photos in the one campaign, and as long as you credit it fine and you have their yes, then you've got these beautiful photos. And we've been recently sharing a lot of people's Facebook albums. Like today we shared a beautiful Somalia, not beautiful, but striking Somalia album from Medicine Sans Frontier, Doctors Without Borders, from straight from their Facebook feed, and realize that we don't have to they don't have our photos to be share worthy, so just utilize other people.
What are your thoughts?
We use Flickr just as a host, sort of, as a way to store pictures, but not necessarily, we don't necessarily feed them out. The one way it has been kind of useful is for journalists or our team who are working in sort of insecure areas. And a lot of times you can access Flickr and you can't access an FTP to get to a journalist. So it's kind of become that for us.
I use Flickr almost every day to post pictures relevant to my blog posts on UN Dispatch, and the only thing I would urge is that keep it sort of open, so Creative Commons licensing. So those are the only ones that I can use. Any Flickr?
Yeah, we have.
Okay. I think that's about all the time we have. All in Jessica. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Brenton. I'm with Seneca Global Development, one of the organizations that co-founded this organization's new network. I just want to say, wow, great job, panelists. Thank you so much. I know I personally learned a lot, and I think probably the panelists here learned a lot from each other too. I know we're all in this together, we're all learning together, and so I think events like this really help us to do that. I encourage you all, I put in our plug, sign up for the network, come to our events. We're going to have them probably once a month, and hopefully there'll be useful things like this. We want it to be very user-friendly that we'll actually get something out of. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for coming. So, thanks.